Picture this. You are riding a horse for 14 hours straight across 1,000 miles of open desert. There are no towns, no buildings, no walls, nothing but flat land in every direction for as far as you can see. Now answer this question honestly. Where exactly do you think you are going to go to the bathroom? This is not a joke question. This was a real, daily, unavoidable problem for every single cowboy on every single cattle drive in American history. And the way they solved it tells you more about life on the frontier than almost any other piece of cowboy history. By the end of this video, you are going to understand the actual system cowboys used, why women on the trail had it dramatically harder, and one specific rule that every experienced cowboy followed that absolutely saved lives. Let's start with the most basic fact. On a cattle drive, you were almost never alone. A typical cattle drive crew was 8 to 12 men, riding together, eating together, and sleeping together in the same open camp every single night for months. There were no tents with walls, there was no separate space. Everyone could see everyone, basically all the time. So the first thing you need to throw out of your head is any idea of privacy like we understand it today. Cowboys simply did not have it. If you needed to relieve yourself, you walked a short distance away from the group, usually behind a rock, a bush, or just far enough that you were technically out of direct eyesight. And that was considered completely normal and acceptable. There was an unspoken rule on every cattle drive. Nobody commented on it. Nobody made jokes about it, at least not seriously. It was simply something every single person did multiple times a day, and the entire crew silently agreed to pretend it wasn't happening. This might sound awkward to us today, but you have to remember, these men spent 16 hours a day together, slept 4 feet apart from each other, and shared food from the same pot. Bathroom privacy was simply not a battle worth fighting on the frontier. Now, here is where it gets specific. During the day, while riding with the herd, cowboys developed an actual unofficial system. If a cowboy needed to step away, he would simply drop slightly behind the herd or move to the side, take care of business quickly, and catch back up. Since the herd was moving slowly anyway, cattle drives covered only about 10 to 15 miles a day. This was not difficult. Nobody waited for you. Nobody made a big deal out of it. You just rejoined the group. At night, when the crew set up camp, things were slightly more organized. Most experienced trail bosses designated an unspoken direction away from camp, usually downwind and away from the water source where men would go. This wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't a rule posted on a sign. It was simply something passed down from experienced cowboys to new riders, usually within the first day or two of joining a drive. And this brings us to genuinely one of the most important pieces of practical cowboy knowledge that most people have never heard. Cowboys never, under any circumstances, went near the water source the herd was drinking from. This sounds obvious today, but on the actual frontier, water sources were often limited to a single creek, river, or watering hole for miles in any direction. If that water became contaminated, it didn't just create a bad smell. It could spread dysentery and other diseases through the entire crew and through the cattle herd itself. A sick crew on a cattle drive wasn't an inconvenience. It could be a death sentence, hundreds of miles from the nearest doctor. So the unofficial first rule every new cowboy learned, often within hours of joining a drive, was simple. Never relieve yourself anywhere near the water. This single piece of frontier discipline likely saved more lives on cattle drives than almost any weapon a cowboy carried. Daytime was one thing. Nighttime created a completely different problem. Remember, cowboys slept outdoors in bedrolls, often in freezing temperatures, sometimes during actual rainstorms. Getting up in the middle of the night, walking away from the warmth of the campfire, dealing with whatever you needed to deal with, and then coming back to a cold bedroll was not exactly appealing. So what actually happened is something most depictions of the Wild West never show you. Many cowboys simply held it as long as humanly possible, sometimes through significant discomfort, specifically to avoid leaving their bedroll during freezing nights. Cowboy diaries and memoirs from the era genuinely mention this as one of the small daily miseries of trail life. Not a dramatic life-or-death moment, but a constant, low-level discomfort that defined what it actually felt like to live on the frontier. When men absolutely had to go during the night, they typically did not wander far. Wandering too far from camp in pitch darkness in open country came with real risks, snakes, scorpions, getting lost, or in some regions, encountering predators or even hostile situations. So the actual practice was usually just a short distance from the bedroll, facing away from the group, done as quickly as possible, and then straight back to whatever warmth was left. There is also something genuinely fascinating here about toilet paper, or rather, the complete absence of it. Cowboys used whatever natural materials were available: leaves, smooth stones, corn cobs if they happened to have them from camp food, or in many documented cases, simply a handful of grass. This was such a universal and unremarkable part of frontier life that it rarely even gets mentioned directly in historical records, specifically because nobody at the time considered it worth writing down. It was just normal life. Now we need to talk about something that almost never comes up in Wild West history, and it is honestly one of the most overlooked aspects of frontier life. While the vast majority of cattle drive cowboys were men, women absolutely existed on the frontier, as settlers, as wagon train travelers heading west, and occasionally even as cooks or family members traveling alongside cattle operations. And for women, the complete lack of privacy created a dramatically harder situation. Historical accounts and pioneer diaries from wagon trains heading west describe women specifically organizing themselves into small groups, walking further from the trail than men typically did, and using long skirts as a form of portable privacy, essentially using the fabric of their own clothing as a barrier, while another woman stood facing outward, watching for anyone approaching. This wasn't just modesty. It was often genuinely necessary for safety, since a woman alone, away from the group, in unfamiliar territory, was significantly more vulnerable than a man in the same situation. Pioneer women's diaries from the Oregon Trail and similar westward routes specifically mention this buddy system as something every woman on the journey understood without needing to be told. There's also something worth mentioning about timing. Multiple historical accounts describe women on wagon trains deliberately waiting for specific rest stops or timing their needs around when the wagons stopped to water the animals, specifically so they wouldn't need to ask the entire group to pause separately. This required an exhausting amount of planning and discomfort that male travelers on the same trails simply never had to think about. Here is something that connects directly back to something we talked about in our last video: the chuck wagon cook. Remember, the cook traveled ahead of the herd to set up camp before everyone arrived. This meant the cook was often the one responsible for selecting the campsite layout, which included quietly deciding where the bathroom area of camp would be, based on wind direction, distance from water, and distance from where food would be prepared. This sounds like a minor detail, but it genuinely mattered. A poorly chosen campsite layout could mean smell drifting directly into where men were eating, or worse, contamination risks if the area was chosen too close to a water source the herd needed. Experienced cooks took this seriously, even though it was never written into any official job description. It was simply expected, quietly, as part of running a competent camp. And on cattle drives where this wasn't handled well, where an inexperienced or careless cook set up camp poorly, crews genuinely got sick more often. There are historical accounts of entire cattle drives being slowed down or delayed because illness spread through a poorly managed camp, all traced back to something as simple as bad campsite placement. So in a strange way, the cook wasn't just responsible for keeping cowboys fed. He was quietly responsible for keeping the entire camp from getting sick, through decisions most cowboys never even consciously thought about. So here is what we actually learned today. There was no privacy on a cattle drive, and cowboys simply accepted that as a basic fact of frontier life. There was an unofficial but universally followed system for handling bathroom needs during the day and at night, built around one unbreakable rule: never near the water. Women on the frontier faced a dramatically harder version of this same problem, requiring planning and group cooperation that male cowboys never had to think about. And even something as overlooked as where to place the bathroom area of a campsite could be the difference between a healthy cattle drive and one slowed down by sickness. None of this makes it into the movies. None of this makes it into the romantic version of the Wild West we usually see. But this is what life on the actual frontier looked like, in the small, unglamorous details that nobody bothered writing down because to the people living it, it was simply normal. Next week on WestCrypt, we are going to talk about something every cowboy carried but almost never talked about, and it had nothing to do with guns.